In this video, I'll be explaining and demonstrating inversions of chords. I'll also be explaining how to label chords and their inversions using symbols such as these. Before you watch this video, it's very important that you are comfortable in creating chords. Please have a look at my other videos in this series of videos on chords first, if you need to. Let's start by examining chord 1 in C major. If you watched parts 3 and 4 of this series of videos, you'll remember that we calculate this chord by taking the note number 1 of C major, as we're looking at chord 1, and pop it at the bottom of our chord. Musicians call this bottom note, or bass note, the root. We then add a third above, the E. Now musicians refer to this next note in the chord as the third, as it is a third above the root. And to complete the chord, we add another third on top of the E. This chord note is called the fifth, as it is a fifth above the root. It's very important that you remember this, as knowing how to identify the root, third and fifth will help you with inversions. When the root is sat at the bottom of the chord, as in this example, we can say that it is in root position. Musicians often write the chord as 1A. The Roman numeral 1 you'll have seen before, and you'll know that it means we're looking at chord 1. The A means that the chord is written in root position. In other words, with the root note at the very bottom. Now, a word of warning before we carry on. A lot of students trip up here and think that the A is telling them to write the chord with a note A in the bass or the root. The A is merely telling us that the chord is written in root position. In this example, the root note is a C. Chords don't have to be written with the root note at the bottom. When we move the root so it sits above some or all of the other notes in the chord, we call these types of chords inversions. Let me explain. Have a look at this chord. It's still chord 1 of C major, as there is still a C, E and G, but this time the E, or the third of the chord, is at the bottom. Because the third is at the bottom and not the root, which you remember is the C highlighted red here, we can say that this chord is an inversion of chord 1. We still write 1 or I to represent that it is chord 1, but we place a letter B next to it to show that the third is at the bottom. So an A means root position, whereas B means that the third is at the bottom. This is where many students go wrong, as they think that the B means that there is a note B at the bottom of the chord. As you can see, this is not the case in this example. There is an E at the bottom. Here's chord 1 again. This time, the G, or the fifth of the chord, is at the bottom, which I've highlighted blue. The third and the root are sitting above the fifth of the chord. As before, we use a Roman numeral 1 to show that it is chord 1, and you've probably already guessed that when the fifth is at the bottom, we use the letter C. Now, there's a couple of things to point out here. Firstly, I keep referring to the note at the bottom. Musicians prefer to use the word bass as opposed to bottom. Bass means low, and in the case of chords, it's referring to the lowest note. Secondly, the title of this video is Inversions. I've already mentioned that inversions are when the root note is not in the bass, but it's worth noting that when the third is in the bass, it can also be called first inversion. When the fifth is in the bass, it can also be called second inversion. In other words, chord 1B could also be referred to as first inversion of chord 1 in C major. A bit of a mouthful, I know, but it's worth knowing that chords can be referred to in different ways. Finally, a chord with the root at the bottom is referred to as being in root position. Let's look at another chord before we attempt some music theory exercises. Let's look at chord 5 from G major. Here is chord 5A from G major, which consists of the note D, F sharp and A. Remember that this chord is made using the fifth note of G major, the fifth note because this is chord 5, the D, and then a third is placed on top, the F sharp, and then another third on top, the A. So the D is the root, the F sharp the third, and the A the fifth. Chord 5B will have the third in the bass, the F sharp. So this chord is the first inversion of chord 5, or chord 5B. Finally, here is chord 5C, or second inversion. This time, the A is in the bass. Hopefully by now you're getting confident in what the letters A, B or C mean. Things do get a little more complicated if you're asked a question like this. Identify this chord, stating whether it is in root position, first or second inversion. The key is F major. We follow a few steps to identify this chord. Number 1, calculate the key. Well, in this question, this step is very easy, as the question has helpfully already given this information, F major. Make a note of it. Secondly, calculate each note name and scrap duplicates. Okay, the notes we have, working from bottom to top, are D, B flat, another D, F, and another B flat. Scrap duplicates means that if any note names appear more than once, we can ignore them. For example, in this chord, both the D and B flat appear twice. We only need to make a list of single note names in the chord. In other words, we can say that our chord contains the notes D, B flat, and F. Make a note of these note names. Number 3, stack the notes in thirds to calculate the root note of the chord. We now try to put these notes onto a stave so that they are sitting neatly on top of each other. Now, if you watched my other videos on chords, you remember I refer to them as balancing balls. So let's put the D in the bass, the B flat on top, and then the F. Now, they're not sitting neatly. There's too much of a gap between each note. This time, let's put the B flat in the bass, the D on top, and then the F. Now this time they are sitting neatly on top of each other. If we remove the staves, we have our balancing balls. This is the pattern you must always aim for when stacking in thirds. The point of stacking these notes into thirds is because we now know our chord, whatever it is now in root position. The B flat is the root of the chord we are calculating. Step 4, calculate the chord. So, as we know the root of the chord, it is a simple case of matching it with a note from the scale of the key we are in. Let me explain. We know the key is F major. Here's a scale of F major. We know that the root is B flat. We look for a B flat in the scale, and whatever number of the scale that note is, that will tell us which chord we are looking at. So, here's the B flat. It's note number 4. This means that the chord is chord 4. Make a note of this, and remember, we use Roman numerals rather than writing the number 4. Now, we haven't quite finished. Although we've worked out that this is chord 4, the question clearly asks us to also work out the inversion, so there's just one more step to take. Step 5, calculate the inversion. Have another look at the chord in question. All we need to do is identify the note in the bass, which I've highlighted pink. It's the note D. Looking back at our chord, which we stacked in thirds, we can see that the D is the third of the chord. Therefore, with the third of the chord in the bass, we can say that it is in first inversion. First inversion is represented by the letter B. Make a note of this. So, as we followed all of the steps, we've now calculated this chord and its inversion, and we can give our answer. This is chord 4B from F major. There are quite a few steps to take, and it does take practice to get this right. Just remember, like most things, it will get easier with practice. Let's try one final example before we end. Identify this chord, stating whether it is in root position, first or second inversion. So let's work through our instructions. Step 1, calculate the key. Well, the key signature has 3 sharps, meaning that we could be in A major, or F sharp minor. This is where knowledge of minor scales is invaluable. If we were in F sharp minor, we'd expect to see an E sharp, as it would be the raised 7th. As there is no E sharp, we can safely say that we are in A major. Have a look at my videos on minor scales if you need any help with understanding this. Make a note of the correct key. Step 2, calculate each note name and scrap duplicates. So working from the bottom of the chord, the notes we have are B, E, B, G sharp. Don't forget that it is G sharp and not just a G. Always keep an eye on key signatures, and another E. We've got 2 E's and 2 B's, so we scrap one of each to give us just the different note names. Make a note of these note names. Step 3, stack the notes in thirds to calculate the root note. If we put the B in the bass, it means that neither the G sharp or E sit a third above. Let's try the G sharp in the bass. The B sits neatly above, but the E does not. So let's try E in the bass, and we can see that the G sharp and the B sit neatly above, stacked in those balancing balls I mentioned earlier. So we now know that E is the root of our chord. Step 4, calculate the chord. Here's a scale of A major, and remember in step 1 we worked out that we are in the key of A major. Remember, we need to match our root note, the E, with an E from the scale. Whatever scale note number the E is, that will tell us which chord we are working with. So here's the E. It's note number 5 from our scale, so we know that our chord is chord 5. Make a note of this. Step 5. Calculate the inversion. Look again at the chord in question. There is a B in the bass, which I've highlighted blue. We worked out earlier that E is the root. The G sharp is therefore the third, whereas the B is the fifth. Therefore, as the B is in the bass of the chord in the question, we can say that the fifth is in the bass, or it is in second inversion. We use the letter C to represent second inversion. Make a note of this. So, as we followed all of the steps, we've now calculated this chord and its inversion and can give our answer. This is chord 5C from A major. Before we end, just one final word about root position chords. Here's chord 5A from D major, which we looked at earlier. It's quite common for root position chords to be written without the letter A. Some music theory exam boards would allow you to refer to this root position chord as either 5 or 5A. Personally, I think it's good practice to get into the habit of writing chords with a letter name, whether or not they are in root position. Do check with your exam board or teacher before you start leaving out the letter A for root position chords. But remember, it's only for root position where you might have the option to leave out the letter. For first and second inversions, you must always include either the letter B or C, as in these examples. I do hope this video about inversions has been useful to you. Thanks for watching.